impatient person. As a matter of fact, as I go to other campuses to talk, nobody can introduce me. They don't know what in the wide world I'm a part of. And so I always sort of locate myself in the universe myself. And I say that I am a part of a group of young people, very young people, who in some vague, unvague way have decided to move into history and bend it. And I think that the forces that go on in this world have conspired in such a fashion that indeed this is really a possibility for you gathered here. And therefore I become impatient, very impatient, when I think that you are not assuming the responsibility of trying to discover what it means to be a part of a covenant group. For nobody's going to bend history that hasn't learned what it means to be disciplined. And I do not mean disciplined in the sense of having a series of rules or a series of times in which you brush your teeth or get up in the morning. But the kind of discipline in which you take upon yourself the burden of any group you choose to be a part of. You take upon yourself the whole burden. Life is good. All right. I want to read to you some poetry. And again, pay no attention to any ideas in it, but expose yourself to the imagery and just let it Blessed are you among women, and blessed is your child. The female is in all of us men folk as well as you women folk. Sometimes we men become greatly ashamed of it, and sometimes if it protrudes, we could become more than ashamed of it, but it's there. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is your child. What an honor it is to have the mother of my Lord come and see me. Why, as soon as your greeting reached my ears, the child within me jumped for joy. Oh, how happy is the woman who believes in God, for he does make his promises to her come true. Then Mary said, my heart is overflowing with praise to my Lord. My soul is full of joy in God my Savior, for he has deigned to notice me. He has deigned to notice me, his humble servant. And after this, all the people, whoever shall be, will call me the happiest of women. The one who can do all things has done great things for me. Oh, holy is his name. Truly his mercy rests on those who fear him in every generation. He has shown the strength of his arm. He has swept away the high and mighty. He has set kings down from their thrones and lifted up the humble. He has satisfied the hungry with good things and sent the rich away with empty hands. Yes, he has helped Israel, his child. He has remembered the mercy that he promised to our fathers, to Abraham and his sons. It's one of the great poems in the New Testament. Here's rather an interesting thing. I knew myself inspired by the Spirit, and I heard from behind me a loud voice as a trumpet call, saying, "Write down in this book what you see and send it to the 7 churches." I turned to see whose voice it was that was speaking to me, and when I had turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among these lampstands I saw someone like the Son of Man. He was dressed in a long robe with a golden girdle round his breast. His head and his hair were white as snow-white wool. His eyes blazed like fire, and his feet shone as the finest bronze glows in the furnace. His voice had the sound of a great waterfall, and I saw that in his right hand he held 7 stars. A sharp 2-edged sword came out of his mouth, and his face was ablaze like the sun at his very height. When my eyes took in this sight, I fell at his feet like a dead man. And then he placed his right hand upon me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, the ever-living one. I am he who was dead, and now you see me alive for timeless ages. I hold in my hand the keys of death and the grave. Therefore write down what you have seen, both the things which are now and the things which are to be hereafter." Here's another little bit of poetry. I saw the holy Jerusalem descending from God out of heaven, radiant with the glory of God. Her brilliance sparkled like a very precious jewel with the clear light of crystal. Around her she had a vast and lofty wall in which there were 12 gates, and 12 angels were at the gate. There were 12 names inscribed over the 12 gateways, and they are the names of the 12 sons of Israel. On the east there were 3 gateways, on the north 3 gateways, on the east 3 gateways, and on the west 3 gateways. The wall of the city had 12 foundation stones. On these were engraved the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The one who was talking to me had a golden rod in his hand with which to measure the city, its gateways, and its walls. The city lies 4 square, its length equal to its breadth. He measured the city with his rod, and it was 12,000 furlongs in each direction, for its length, breadth, and height are all equal. Then he measured its wall and found that to be 144 yards high by human measurement. The wall itself was built of translucent stone, while the city was of purest gold, and the brilliance of glass. The foundation stones of the wall of the city were fashioned out of every kind of precious stone. The first foundation stone was emerald, and the rest were filled with pearls and diamonds and green goldstone, and the street of the city was purest gold, gleaming like glass itself. I could see no temple in the city, for the Lord, the Almighty God, and the Lamb are themselves the temple. This city has no need for the light of sun or moon, for the splendor of God fills it with light, and its radiance comes from the Lamb. The nations walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. The city's gates shall stand open day after day, and there will never be any night there. Into the city they will bring the splendors and the honors of the nation. But nothing unclean, no one who deals in filthiness and lies shall ever be there at any time. Only those whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Only wish that had been in a book by somebody like Ionesco or even Beckett. Or Kafka. Wonder what you'd have made of it. It was a little bit of a problem the other night there, wasn't there? But it was interesting to reflect upon, wasn't it? What we're trying to do now is to find out how to enter into dialogue with a historical community which understands itself in a certain way and who sees its primary task in history of announcing to the world the way it understands itself. Announcing to the world the way it understands itself. And one way that we have gone at that is to look a little bit at the tradition of the church and then to look at its classical literature. And its classical literature it calls the scriptures, or the Bible, the books. And at the moment, we're attempting to look at the way various poets and short story writers and dramatists and novelists and musicians articulated the self-understanding of this community. If we call this self-understanding, as they did, the good news, then we are asking the way these people attempted to articulate, to communicate the good news. And the good news was something that happened to them. This is what a self-understanding is. A happening in your life that, so to speak, illuminates the way that you can go about doing your living and doing your dying, not incidentally. And so we are looking at the way the synoptic writers, or Mark, in just a phenomenal literary style, articulated the gospel. And then we've looked at the way some fella, I don't even know who he is, named John, in again just simply an amazing play, articulated what had happened to him. And now tonight we're going to look at a way a fella named Paul went about trying to talk about this which had happened to him, or the way he was given now to live his life. To live his life. And of course, every age has been interested in that dialogue because every man is interested in how he's going to live his life. That's what it means to be a human being. And he may not be impressed by this dialogue, but he's interested in it precisely when this question that is latently present in his life becomes overt. And so tonight, let's look at this fellow Paul as another interpreter of the Christian self-understanding. And I suppose that it might be helpful to begin with certain terms that this fellow uses. I suppose you've discovered in your study that it's tremendously important to get a hold of the key signs and symbols that a person uses. If you want to finally understand me, you're going to have to get a hold of certain basic and fundamental symbols that have been forged out of my very lifeblood. And if I'm to get to know you, I've got to understand these pivotal terms that you use to say unto yourself and to the world just who it is that you are. And all of us have certain key terms that are just burdened with meaning in terms of our little universe. As a matter of fact, our little world is fundamentally formed out of these terms. And every term that we use is a little world within our world. And when you go to study a man, you want to try to get just as clear as you can what he's pointing to, just as clear as you can, this universe that a certain term is pointing to. And of course, one of the great problems of language is that some people might use Y to point to this kind of a world, and somebody might use Y to point to this kind of a world. This is why words simply on the face can't be taken in utter seriousness, save you live in a community where there is a common sense. A common sense. And even then, of course, it's never an absolute understanding of one another's basic categories, but enough that direct, so to speak, communication can take place. If, however, you are dealing in a different time and a different age, then you've got this horrible problem of shedding your own skin and then getting into somebody else's skin, getting into their world before you can really see what they're pointing to. And then after you see what they're pointing to, you have to then shed that skin and get back into your own skin and see what reality in your own life that you point to, maybe with another term entirely. And only then does comprehension take place. Those of you who are students of history understand that this is the historical methodology that has been forged out particularly in the last 100 years and maybe even become overt in the last 25 years. I want to start with this term body in Paul. Now you and I, when we see this term, we understand it primarily through the eyes of the Greeks and not through the eyes of the Hebrew and not through the eyes of St. Paul. Paul points with this term to a very complex phenomenon, as a matter of fact, and one that is in a way very, very surprising, I think, to us, and one that is not really easy for us to get a hold. For when you're used to use a term to point to this, it's very, very even difficult even to believe that somebody else was pointing to another kind of a reality entirely by our particular term. When Paul used the term body, he was talking about the psycho-physio-sociological complex of relationships that I am at any time I come upon myself, plus a capacity to take an attitude toward being this kind of a physio-psycho-sociological complex. Now, what do you mean by that? Whenever I come upon myself in all kind of relationships. I am related to a certain culture, to a certain nation, to a certain family, to a certain profession. Every time I come upon myself, I have a certain kind of a body in the way you and I use this term. most of the time. I come upon myself with a certain communal or social memory. I come upon myself with a certain kind of a personal memory that is utterly, in the final sense, private to me, in that nobody else can finally feel after it the way that I can feel after. I come upon myself with certain neurotic patterns already developed. Everything that you would mean by being a being in the world is what Paul meant by the body. All of this whole complex relationship. If we were to move to contemporary psychology, and recently we in our house church have been working upon this, you would mean something like this. Within every man is some kind of a libidinal thrust, and by libidinal thrust I do not mean for the moment what Freud meant at all, but I mean that thrust which is behind the manifestation of the unconscious drives with man on the level of the biological that Freud was dealing with. I mean to point to that mysterious showed-upness that I am, that feels like a thrust into history. And again and again and again in Western civilization, psychologists, whether of the philosophical type or of the more of the scientific type, they've fundamentally seen man as a thrust, as a drive. And this has always been the point of mystery, beyond which we cannot go. Here is man with a drive. Now, in our day, it would seem to me that there are three different schools of psychology in terms of this libidinal thrust. There is the type that sees this manifest on the biological or the natural level primarily, in and through the so-called physical propensities of man, of which maybe Freud would be a fine illustration. And there are those who see this thrust without necessarily denying this, but primarily in terms of its sociological formations, such as, I think Jung ought to be here, but maybe Horney and Sullivan would be more typical representatives of this. These are the people who seek satisfaction of certain drives. These are the people that seek acceptance in some kind of a sociological context. And then there are the type, call them the rationalists, who see this libidinal thrust manifest primarily upon the rational level. I think that among the typical characters, that Adler is a good type to put here. Probably your existential analysis, your rational psychotherapist belong here. Now, I would suggest to you that if you and I look at man today, from the psychological perspective, that we would tend to draw all of these together and say, yes, man is a thrust that manifests itself on the biological, the sociological, and the rational. That man is the kind of a creature that is seeking satisfaction for certain physical drives. He's the kind of a creature that's got to have some kind of acceptance from his fellow being, and he's the kind of a being that has to have some kind of life images in which to understand what is going on here. Now, this, it seems to me, is the structure of man. All of these, indeed, are a thrust, and man finds he lives in a kind of a world in which there's not only a thrust, but there's a limitation to his thrust. There's a limitation to his thrust. So that Freud saw that the world as it is always limiting man's libidinal thrust, and here the ego was forged out of this. The sociological psychologist sees that man is always up against limits. There never can be the final satisfaction of his need for acceptance in this world. And the rationalist always sees man's life images being limited in that his experience is always outrunning the categories by which he can comprehend the world that he lives in. And out of the conflict of the thrust and the limitation is built the neurotic responses or the healthy responses within the human life. These two are held together. Now, if we took contemporary psychology to understand what Paul meant by the body, this is precisely what he meant. He meant what we today might call body, although good Lord, what in the wide world? It's awful hard to be a Greek at this point, isn't it? For we cannot divide the psyche and the soma.
But Paul would mean both, both what the Greek would call the body, plus this whole complex that today we call the psyche within man. This is what he meant by body. Now, you would have to go on here and put in each one of these the kind of internal patterns that was built up in terms of the concrete external relationships that were just there for a particular man. This would give the whole matrix of the culture in which a man found himself. All of this is what Paul meant for the body. Plus, the capacity, and here you reach the mystery on the other level, plus the capacity of man to stand out from all of this and take an attitude toward it in one form or another. Now, for Paul, this is precisely what man was. That man was all of this, nothing more than this. He was just this, period. And this capacity to take an attitude toward it, to finally receive it or reject it as a whole. Now, over in this pattern, it would mean here that one attitude that a person could take toward this is just to receive it, including the neurotic patterns within it and all of the sickness that was involved in it, period. Or else he could say no to this. And this is precisely Paul's anthropology, or if you like, his psychology. And when a person said no to this, Paul said that this was living life in the flesh. And when he said yes to this, this was living life in the spirit. Or on this pattern, when you dared to receive yourself as given in the world, this was what Paul meant by spirit. When you tried to deny this or pretended that this was not here, then Paul says this is the life of the flesh. And these are the two fundamental categories that Paul uses in terms of this whole conception of body. That man was either a creature of the flesh or he was a creature of the spirit. Now here we have this kind of a problem. Invariably, we attempt to understand this in and through your Greek understanding, which relates this to body as the Greek understood the term body. So that again and again, people have understood this term as if it meant sex, or overeating, or the carnal lusts and desires within man. But no, this was a way of being present to the givenness of our life for Paul, which was a rejection of this. Whereas the term spirit was an attitude in which you receive this. The term spirit also was not an idealistic category, as if man was some kind of a body here, and over above the body or within the body was some kind of a ghostly entity called the spirit. This is never there in your Hebraic thought. This comes out of the Greek thought, as those of you who know Plato and Aristotle know. But this is not your Hebraic psychology. And at the moment, it'd be fine if this is what it was, but it was not this, period. Now, as you might guess, when Paul then dealt with the problem of human life, the problem for him was never here at its root. The problem was at this point. How are you going to relate yourself to the givenness of life? Period. How are you going to relate yourself to the givenness of life? Now, when he used the term world, sometimes he used the term world just to point to this. How are you going to live in this world? How are you going to receive this world? Sometimes he used the term world as coincidental with this, that a person who lived in this world was living a fleshly life, which was really refusing to live in this world in the sense that Paul uses it in this context. Now, then, if you're going to get a hold of Paul in the next step, you have to, it seems to me, understand what it meant to be a man of flesh in some detail. Now, when Paul talks about the man of flesh, he uses many different kinds of categories, and dramatic categories, indeed, that they are, even as Freud's categories are dramatic and seem to me have to be when you're dealing with that kind of an area. But he called the life of the flesh a life of bondage. And when he spelled this out, he saw this bondage in terms of bondage to death, and then bondage to law, and then bondage to sin. And if you're to get a hold of Paul and his thinking, you have to understand what he meant by bondage to death and law and sin. And let's see if we can't and even weave these together in a certain fashion. Paul was not a systematic writer, he's a dramatic writer. He's a symphonic writer, in which he might be dealing with this one place, this another, and perhaps not even try to draw them together into a systematic statement. Now, let's begin here with death. Here is man in this world. And man, sooner or later, becomes aware of the fact that one day he's not in this world, period. That he goes down here in the grave, that he dies, period. This guy